In a moment of honesty, if you're a parent, I'm sure the thought has gone through your mind, and David, it may have gone through our minds as well, about what's going to happen when it's time for your kid to get married. You know, you probably thought, I can probably pick a better person for him or her than they're going to be able to pick, so why don't they just let me go ahead and tell them who it is they need to get married to? We'll see. We're a long way from that. But that idea of an arranged marriage, you might think that it's something of the past, but studies tell us that if we look at a worldwide picture, that the estimates are that 54% of all marriages in the world are what we would call an arranged marriage. And if you go to a country such as India, the figure they think is as high as 89% of the marriages are arranged by the parents. Well, if you were to go to People's Square in Shanghai on any given Saturday or Sunday afternoon, you would be able to wander in on what they call the Shanghai marriage market. Parents gather there to find just the right person for their unmarried child. They look at things such as income and job and home ownership, the age of the people, the education level of the children, and so on. And that information is posted on a placard, a big sheet of paper, and they string up strings from street post to street post, from street post to tree to tree. So you can imagine just this whole square filled with clotheslines and advertisements, I guess for lack of a better word, of the attributes of each of the child hanging there. And the parents go about trying to find the best match for their young boy or their young daughter. Well, it's not just a phenomenon that happens in China, though. It's also something that's catching on in the United States. There's a thing called the Matchmaking Institute in New York City. And it tells us that matchmaking now accounts for approximately $500 million of the $1 billion dating industry in our country. People are spending $1 billion a year to try to find the right person. But you might wonder, what's the appeal then of a matchmaker? Well, there are a lot of singles that have tried online dating services. They apparently are getting weary of filling out one computerized form after another and letting the computer try to decide who it is that they would best match up with. And so they're relying now on humans, going back looking for matchmakers to try to find that perfect person for them. Which sort of brings us to today's scripture. It's the story of a mother-in-law that's a matchmaker. You see, tragedy strikes Naomi's family. Her husband has died. Both of her sons have died. And in that particular society, that leaves Naomi as a very vulnerable person. Because in the ancient male-dominated culture, she has little chance now for a healthy life. And to beat it all, she moved to Moab to be with her husband. So she left her hometown. And now she's there, and she is pretty much not only a widow, but sort of a stranger. Because there's no one there that she's related to. And it's time to go back home, where she has a family, where she has friends that maybe will help to take care of her, maybe to help provide for her. And going with Naomi are her two daughters-in-law. They escort her back to her ancestral home. And she's trying to get them to go back to Moab. She says, you got me here. I'm back home, but you need to go back to your home. Go on back to Moab. Go back and maybe find a husband there. And Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, does. But one daughter named Ruth decides that she is going to stay there. She's going to remain with Naomi in this country that is foreign to her. And so she utters those words which you may have heard at a wedding or two along the way. Where you go, I will go, and your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. But back home in Bethlehem, things are still difficult for Naomi. She and Ruth are living off of what are called gleanings. They are basically the leftovers that Hebrew law required landowners to make available to the poor when they went out and harvested their wheat or their crops. Leave some around the edges. Don't pick it all. Let them go and glean a little bit of that food so that they'll have something to live on. And it's at this point, as the gleaning process goes on, that Naomi notices something. She notices that there's an older gentleman. He owns the land that Ruth is gleaning off of, and it appears that he is impressed with Ruth, attracted to her even. You see, Boaz has noticed how hard Ruth is working at this backbreaking, demeaning kind of labor. Through the grapevine, he's heard the tragic story of how she lost her husband, how she lost her father-in-law, how she lost her brother-in-law, and he's impressed that she's chosen to move from her family home in Moab to live and to help support this mother-in-law of hers in Bethlehem. Apparently, Ruth was a remarkable woman, and Boaz is smitten. He recognizes that there's something special about this girl. Well, Naomi sees the special treatment that Ruth receives from Boaz. He tells his workers, leave a little bit extra grain. Don't quite glean and take as much as you normally take. You got to leave a little extra. Let Ruth get some for her and Naomi. And he also tells them, keep an eye on her. Make sure that she is safe. Well, Ruth just goes out and she gets the grain. It appears that she doesn't notice this guy, the owner of the vineyard, falling in love with her. But Naomi does. Her wiser mother-in-law sees that there is an attraction growing even if Ruth doesn't understand it. And so Naomi, the matchmaker, she didn't need some computer questionnaire to determine the compatibility here. She didn't need a computer to mash the numbers together and say, oh, this would be a perfect match. Instead, she matches Ruth's need, maybe, with Boaz's ability to provide and the desire that she sees in Boaz to have a relationship with Ruth. Now, you got to remember, in the world of that day, marriage worked a whole lot differently than it does today. A lot of times there was no romance involved. There was oftentimes instead a large dose of practicality. It seemed as if this was a perfect match. Boaz saw that she was a good worker. He was favorable toward her, and Naomi put the picture together and says, looks like a good match. Ruth does what she's told. Naomi devises a plan, a bold plan. She tells Ruth that you need to go in the middle of the night to the threshing floor where Boaz is sleeping, and in essence, by lifting up the cover and sleeping at his feet, she was forcing him into a relationship. Because if anybody else woke up that morning and saw Ruth there, Boaz would have no other option really than to say, okay, I've asked her to be my wife. Because it would have been unseemly for her to be sleeping at his feet for any other reason. So Naomi not only is matchmaker, but she's sealing the deal with that simple action. And Ruth does as she's told. And as the story goes on, there's a few other hurdles in between verse 13 and verse 5, and when it gets to it in verse 4. All the details are ironed out. And in essence, we find a story that ends with what is the equivalent of they lived happily ever after. Ruth and Boaz. Well, in the conclusion, though, the author tells us something, that Ruth and Boaz have a son. And then it seems to be almost a throwaway line at the very end there. We get at what actually may be the whole reason that the book of Ruth was written. It says, and this son, they named him Obed. Nothing spectacular about that. He became the father of Jesse, Okay, so Obed had a son. But Jesse had a son too. And his name was David, who went on to become the greatest king in all of Israel. And so this makes Ruth, who was far from royal, who was simply a down-on-her-luck Moabite outsider in Israel, the great-grandmother of the greatest king that Israel ever had. So in one sense, I think that story of Ruth and Naomi is really a story about David, in that it lays out his lineage. It shows us God's work in that lineage long before David was ever born. And so I suppose you could say that God was really a matchmaker here, because he got everything in place so that one day David would be born, and one day Israel would have the king that God wanted them to have. You see, Naomi the matchmaker was simply getting Boaz and Ruth together. But it appears as if, as I said on my Facebook sort of teaser for this sermon, that there was another part of the story. And that story, that other part, is that God was doing some matchmaking of his own behind the scenes, bringing the situation together and forming the foundation of what would become the nation itself. You know, a lot of biographies help us to understand the significant events in the life of individuals. They tell us stories that oftentimes predate the subject of the biography itself. They try to give us a sense of the soil from which this person grew. You know, it's the backstory of why this person is who they are today, the influences that made them who they are. And so when we think of King David, a man that the scriptures say was after God's own heart, a man that one day from his lineage Messiah would come, who would rule Israel forever, it begins with the story of Ruth and Naomi. Long before David, you see, was more courageous than any member of the Israelite army, long before he took on Goliath with a simple stone and sling, there was a young woman named Ruth. And she daringly left her home to go and care for a vulnerable mother-in-law. Generations before David spent those quiet days shepherding his father's flock, there was a young Moabite woman that humbled herself to glean from the edges of that harvest field to provide for her family. You see, long before David was plucked from obscurity and anointed by Samuel as the next king of Israel, Boaz noticed Ruth working there in the fields, and it's through Naomi's matchmaking that the two were married. You see, when people go to those internet dating sites, most often they're thinking about their own lives and their own satisfaction. They're trying to find the man and woman of their dreams, whether it's computer dating or whether it's matchmaking, whether it's a more traditional means. They're looking for the person that they think will make them happy, that will complete their lives, and that will give them peace. You see, the book of Ruth is a love story that has a greater reach than just what those involved were looking for. You see, it may be a Disney princess-like moment that happens in that story, but the real love story is the one between Ruth and Naomi that remains for generations, that she would willingly follow so that God could use her to make a difference. You see, this kind of legacy of love, it tells us something about Ruth's character, and it should also be a call to each one of us. Are we willing to humble ourselves, to do the hard work of caring for the hungry, of reaching out to those that are in need in our community, of doing things that will help someone to experience the fullness in life that they need? Will we humble ourselves and do the equivalent of gleaning in that field? How about, are we able to risk our comfort? Are we able to walk side by side with someone that's vulnerable around us? Are we willing to trust that God is at work in our lives even when we're not sure that we can see God's hand on us? I'm sure that Naomi didn't realize that King David was going to be born a couple of generations later. But yet she was faithful, I think. Ruth teaches us that true love, I believe, is to call to love, is our call to love God so deeply that we will follow where God leads through our own love and through our own service to others. And so my question for you this morning is simple. Are you truly in love with God? Are you willing to be used as He would use you? Are you willing to offer yourself in service to Him so that His love can work through you? Do you know what's going to happen 2 generations after we leave this place because of what you do for God today? That's a question to consider. That's the one that'll be the game changer. Because we have to learn to trust God so that everything we do, whether it's menial or whether it's meaningful or whether it's just something that has to be done, God can take it and use it in a way that we can never imagine. So think about that. Are you truly in love with God? And will you willingly let God take you and use you for God's purposes, not your own?